Right now, most of the world is watching the Middle East or waiting for the next crisis in Taiwan. News headlines repeat the same places every day: wars, sanctions, or military threats. But while global attention is locked on those hotspots, something else is happening far away from the cameras. The United States, Russia, and China are quietly focusing on a completely different battlefield. Not a desert, not an island, a frozen ocean at the top of the planet, the Arctic. And the strange part is, almost nobody is talking about it. Because while the world argues about today's conflicts, the most powerful countries on Earth appear to be preparing for something that could shape the next 50 years. Hey, if you're new here, or if you enjoy deep geopolitical investigations like this, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This channel is about understanding the quiet systems behind global power. And if you stay until the end of this video, you'll see why the Arctic might become one of the most important strategic regions on Earth, even though most people barely think about it. Now let's start with a simple question. Why would major powers suddenly care about the Arctic? For most of modern history, the Arctic had almost no geopolitical value. It was too cold, too remote, too expensive to operate in. Ships avoided it. Companies ignored it. Governments treated it as a frozen wasteland. Yes, scientists worked there. Yes, some countries maintained small research stations. But serious competition? Almost none. So why is that suddenly changing? Over the last 10 years, analysts started noticing something unusual. Russia began rebuilding military bases across the Arctic. Bases that had been abandoned since the Cold War. New airfields appeared. New radar systems. New Arctic brigades trained specifically for extreme cold warfare. At first, many observers assumed this was simply Russia strengthening its northern defenses. But then something else happened. The United States began increasing Arctic patrols. Military exercises in Alaska expanded. New strategic investments were announced for ice-capable ships and Arctic infrastructure. Then another unexpected player entered the conversation: China, which raised an obvious question. China doesn't even border the Arctic. So why would Beijing care about a frozen region thousands of kilometers away? That's when analysts started connecting the dots. Because the Arctic is changing. Not politically. Physically. The ice is melting. Every year, large sections of Arctic sea ice disappear during the summer. What used to be a thick frozen barrier is slowly turning into open water. And that single environmental change is quietly creating something new. Shipping routes. Routes that, until recently, simply didn't exist. For centuries, global trade has relied on long maritime corridors. Ships traveling from Asia to Europe usually pass through the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal. It's a long journey, expensive, and vulnerable to disruptions. But if Arctic routes become usable, that journey could become dramatically shorter. In some cases, nearly 2 weeks faster. Think about what that means for global trade. Billions of dollars in cargo moving faster between continents. Lower fuel costs. Less exposure to traditional choke points like the Suez Canal. Suddenly, the Arctic stops looking like empty ice. It starts looking like a global shipping shortcut. And that realization changes everything. Russia understands this better than anyone. Look at a map. Russia has the longest Arctic coastline on the planet. If northern shipping routes become a major trade corridor, most of those routes will pass close to Russian territory, which means Moscow could gain enormous influence over future Arctic shipping. And Russia has been preparing for that scenario. Over the last decade, it has built a network of Arctic ports, military installations, and icebreaker fleets. In fact, Russia now operates more icebreakers than any other country in the world. These ships aren't just for research. They guide commercial vessels through ice-covered waters and protect strategic routes. But shipping lanes are only part of the story, because beneath the Arctic seabed lies something even more valuable: energy. Geologists estimate that the Arctic could contain about 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and roughly 30% of its natural gas reserves. That's an enormous amount of energy, enough to influence global markets for decades. For years, extracting those resources was nearly impossible. The conditions were too extreme. The infrastructure didn't exist. But as technology improves and ice retreats, those barriers are slowly weakening, which means the Arctic could eventually become one of the last major energy frontiers on Earth. And that brings us back to China. Beijing has been watching these developments very closely. Even though China is not an Arctic country, it has declared itself a near-Arctic state. That phrase surprised many policymakers. But China's actions started making sense when analysts examined its long-term strategy. China wants secure trade routes. It wants energy resources. And it wants alternatives to maritime choke points controlled by rival powers. So Beijing began investing in Arctic research missions. Chinese companies partnered with Russian energy projects in northern Siberia. Chinese ice-capable cargo ships started testing Arctic routes. And China introduced the idea of a polar Silk Road, a northern extension of its global trade network. If that network becomes operational, it could reshape trade between Asia and Europe. But this cooperation between Russia and China raised concerns in Western capitals. Because if those two powers dominate Arctic infrastructure and shipping routes, the balance of influence in the region could shift dramatically. So the United States and its allies began responding. NATO countries increased Arctic military exercises. Norway strengthened its northern defenses. Canada expanded surveillance across its Arctic territory. And Washington began reconsidering its long-term Arctic strategy. At this point, the Arctic started looking less like a remote wilderness and more like a strategic chessboard. But the real significance goes even deeper. The Arctic is not just about shipping routes or oil reserves. It's also about geography. The shortest path between Russia and North America passes directly over the Arctic. During the Cold War, this made the region extremely important for missile defense and strategic aviation. That reality still exists today. Modern missile systems, submarine patrols, and early warning radar networks all rely heavily on Arctic geography, which means whoever maintains strong presence in the Arctic gains strategic advantages in global security calculations. And this is the part most people miss. The Arctic is becoming a three-dimensional competition. Energy below the seabed, shipping routes across the ocean, military positioning above and beneath the ice. 3 layers of strategic power, all concentrated in one region, and all developing quietly while global attention stays focused somewhere else. So when you hear analysts talking about the future balance of power, they often mention places like the South China Sea or Eastern Europe. But fewer people talk about the Arctic. Even though the decisions being made there today could shape global trade, energy security, and military strategy for decades. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why are the United States, Russia, and China suddenly paying attention to a frozen ocean? Because the Arctic is no longer just ice. It's opportunity. And whenever massive opportunity appears in geopolitics, competition follows. Quietly at first, then more visibly over time. The Arctic may still look empty on the map, but behind the scenes, a slow strategic race is already underway. A race for routes, a race for resources, and a race for influence in one of the last untouched regions on Earth. And by the time most people realize how important the Arctic has become, the winners of that race may already be decided. If you stayed until the end, you've just explored one of the least discussed geopolitical competitions happening today. Let me ask you something. Do you think the Arctic will remain peaceful cooperation between countries? Or will it slowly turn into the next arena of global rivalry? Write your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy serious geopolitical analysis like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Because sometimes the biggest global power shifts happen in places the world isn't even watching.